What's going on, podcast listeners? My name is Michael Chernow. I am a restaurateur and lifestyle entrepreneur, and I am truly obsessed with living a life better than yesterday through wellness, fitness, and good vibes. I've always wondered if the drive to succeed is something we are born with, or if it's something that is made over time through grit, drive, and perseverance. I get to answer that question exactly, and the goal of this podcast is to talk with people that have absolutely crushed it in life and have inspired me to do the same. This is Born or Made. What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the Born or Made podcast. Today, I have an incredibly inspirational guest. Her name is Goldin. She is the founder and CEO of Hint Beverages. I'm sure you know very, very well Hint. They are all over the place and delicious. She is also the author of Undaunted. Undaunted is her new book and a Wall Street Journal bestseller. She is also a podcaster. She has a podcast called The Goldin Show. I think you're reaching almost 200 episodes. She also has an awesome list of awards. There's so many of them. I just picked out a few that really sort of stood out to me. InStyle magazine awarded her Badass. I think that's probably one of the best awards anybody could ever get. San Francisco Times named her one of the most influential women, which I think is incredible. I think the most important and probably most like difficult job that Kara does is being a mom of 4. She's a mother of 4. I'm a father of 2, and that shit is no joke. Being a mom of 4 is no joke, on top of all the other things. So I can't wait to dig into that. Kara, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I'll give you a little rundown of what we do here. So the Born or Made podcast has been going on for about a year and a half, maybe a little longer. I think we're very close to our 100th episode. I had an idea one day to do a podcast. And I didn't want to just do another podcast where I'm interviewing awesome people, although that's great and cool. And a lot of the podcasts I listen to do that. But I wanted to have some sort of a theme for the podcast. And I've always wondered, and you know, specifically for entrepreneurs, because I'm an entrepreneur, you're an entrepreneur, but I've always wondered what entrepreneurial people / professional athletes, high performers, I always wondered if they were born to do what they do, or if they were made over time. And I think it's such an interesting question, the nature nurture question. Is it a thing or is it not a thing? Maybe it's just not, and everybody's unique and individual and has their own story and path, which is true. But I do love the idea of the question. And the way I like to get there is through storytelling. I love listening to stories, and I really love telling stories. And I think human condition, human nature, just absolutely for thousands of years have loved to sit around the fireplace to listen to great stories, and you absolutely have one. So the way we get to the answer to this question for you specifically is to hear your story, as way back as you're comfortable going, like toddler times.
Right.
And that's what we do. And I've got a couple of questions that I'll ask as well, but this is a storytelling podcast, and I want to hear all about Kara Goldin from the day one.
Okay. All right. So early days of Kara, my first real memory, this is going probably further back than you even wanted to, but when I was a toddler, I lived in Minneapolis, in Edina, Minnesota, and my dad called a family meeting at age 3. I'm like, you've got kids that are slightly older than that. Like, we had never had a family meeting before. I'm the youngest of 5 kids, and I'm like, anybody know what a family meeting is? Like, I'm pretty excited, that we're going to have this meeting. My dad announces that we're moving to Scottsdale, Arizona. He actually bought a house in Scottsdale and didn't tell my mom that we were moving.
Wow. That is a bold move.
Right. Bold, really, really bold move. So he, he said, I'm tired of shoveling snow. He had been with a company called Armor Food Company at the time. And he was like, there's an office in Scottsdale, Arizona. There's like 100,000 people there, and Phoenix and Scottsdale combined. I mean, it was pretty tiny. And so we got on the airplane and went to Scottsdale. And I always joke, still to this day, I have a lot of family still in Arizona, that we were early settlers, and in Arizona, no one was there. And it was, it was super interesting. If you're familiar with Arizona, like I grew up on the front side of Camelback Mountain, and there's some old time families that were there. There was like the Boulders out in Carefree was there, and Camelback Inn, and that was kind of it. And it was just like, it was really pretty, we had to create our own fun. I knew what a scorpion was, and I mean, that was rattlesnakes. I mean, it was really, we had cars there. We didn't just take horses there. It wasn't, I'm not that old, but it was pretty crazy. But it was during a time, dating myself, but in the 1970s, it's like it was a time where, it was interesting time. I mean, it was kind of like coming off of, I had a brother and sister who are 15 and 16 years older than me. They had friends that were a couple of years older that had gone off to Vietnam. And so, my family hadn't. But, I definitely felt it, having brothers and sisters who knew people who were there or who had passed away. And so it was a really, really crazy time to be like, behind them, and so much younger than them, but also felt like it was, time to sort of enjoy and figure things out. Unlike those guys who sort of felt like Minnesota was so great, why are we here? I was kind of like, I don't know, seems pretty cool. There's cactuses, there's mountains to climb. I was an athlete. I was constantly running, and I did gymnastics, and I was always in some kind of sport. And same with the rest of my siblings. And
Can I ask
I
you a
think
question
back,
about that?
yeah, yeah.
So you were an athlete, and you were always into sports. Was that something that your parents sort of proposed for you, or was that something that you just had a drive to do?
It was kind of the one thing that my dad sort of required of all of us, that we always had to be doing some kind of sport. And so, and he didn't care what kind of sport. I mean, it was just, you always had to be doing some kind of sport. So there were certain times of year where we didn't have tournaments that I couldn't do gymnastics. And so I would do soccer, and then I hated softball, but it was like the only sport I could play. So I'd play softball. And I look back on those times when, I mean, I sucked. I was so bad at softball, but I learned to laugh at myself, and I actually learned to really appreciate people who were better than me. Like, I wanted to be on the teams, even though I sort of sucked. I didn't want to be on the team with all people who sucked. I wanted to be on the team with all the good people, and in some like hope that I would actually get better. And I go back to, thinking about that as, ways to build a team, ways to build a company too, that you never want to be around people that are just as good as you. You want to hire people who are better than you, that people who just know their stuff, because it's energizing to learn from these people. And it's sort of counter to, I think, what maybe many people think, but I think many entrepreneurs, when you think back on it, it's sort of how they up their game, right? That they want to surround themselves with people. They want to have people that inspire them, that are, ideal to them in some way, that they can, sort of mentor or have mentors, but also mirror in some way how they're doing things. So I think that's where I learned sort of that aspect. But it's funny, my husband actually grew up in New York and Scarsdale, and we talk about this a lot, because I think growing up in Arizona, the weather is so conducive to being outside. And we had this coach, Mr. Morris, that everybody was terrified of Mr. Morris, because we would show up for school and he'd say like, okay, run a quarter. We're in first grade. We're running a quarter of a mile. And by the end of the year, we were running 2 to 3 miles. I mean, it was like in first grade. I mean,
Wow.
and everybody was doing it. Like there was no way that you could get a pass to not be doing it. And depending on the way that Mr. Morris woke up, he would share with us like, okay, today we're going to run like, be halfway during the year, we're going to run 3 miles. And we'd be like, 3 miles? We just ran 2 miles yesterday. He was like, it doesn't matter, run 3 miles. And it was this, like, we would laugh. I mean, we would just be like, no, Mr. Morris, don't do this to us. But, it just, what it trained us to do, I think too, was also be able to react on the fly, right? And just go with it and just like stop complaining and figure it out along the way. And, and ultimately all of us were really good athletes in our school. I mean, we were all, going and doing sports and in pretty good shape. But I think it's growing up in a place that has that kind of, weather and that sort of environment, but also having a coach like that is constantly pushing you a little bit harder than you ever thought was possible.
You know what I think, something that I say often that I really, and this just reminded me of this. I believe that we can train ourselves to learn to not just accept the hard and the hurt, but to actually love the hard and the hurt. I truly am not who I am today if I didn't really consciously seek out the hard and the hurt, because there's something about powering through adversity for one, but challenge that
Totally.
if you don't do it and you don't have experience with it, you're never actually able to feel the exhilaration of what it means to see the other side of fear, right? Like fear is present in everyone's life. It's just, it might not be real, right? Half the time fear is fabricated in our minds. We're scared of something that doesn't actually even exist yet. We've predisposed ourselves to this sort of outcome that is non-existent. And so we're afraid of what it could be. However, I've just spent so much time thinking about what is on the other side of fear. And the other side of fear, as far as I'm concerned, is real freedom. Because if you could face it,
Yeah.
and nothing can really phase you, you're going to be scared. But like, if you could power through, the other side of fear is so exhilarating.
Yeah. And, you think back on those times where you felt that way, that it was really scary, you were pissed, whatever, that you had to do something, but then you got through it. And maybe you actually did way more than you ever thought you were going to be able to do. Maybe it's not even related to athletics, but maybe it's work. You get given something that you don't want to feel foolish. You don't this wasn't part of your job or whatever it is, but you power through it. And it teaches you how you go from point A to point Z without knowing how to fill in the blanks. You also know how to deal with, difficult people, maybe whatever it is. I mean, there's a lot that can come out of that experience that you kind of are like, okay, like I got through it and I learned some things along the way, including about myself. And I think that that's the thing that I think about, a lot, that we go through life. Maybe these people get plunked into our life that are challenging us, and maybe again, when they're there and they're asking us to do things, we think it's unfair. We're why is this happening in my life? It's not we don't necessarily think of it as a coaching moment, I guess. But then if we sort of miss that aspect in our life along the way, I find then the people that are going and getting coaches or going and getting trainers or whatever it is, they need that back in their life, right? They want somebody to kind of, up their ante a little bit in some ways. And so I think there's something there, right? And the people that maybe are sitting bored and complacent and not really sure exactly, I mean, maybe they need to put that into their own life in some way if they don't know how to set their mind to go and challenge themselves. I'm somebody that is constantly, challenging myself to do new things. And it's something that, is part of my DNA. Anyone who knows me knows that I'm always, trying something new and something that I never thought I wanted to do. And, I again, they're not always things that I end up doing forever, but they're things that I wanted to do. And what I always find is along the way, I learn things that I didn't think I was going to learn going in. And I think that's something that is really, really key. But I think going back to the original sort of, were you born with it or, were you
Don't spill the beans yet. Don't spill the beans yet. We got to get there. So let's get back to your story. So you were deep into sports and you were sort of ambitious there. What happens next?
So the last of 5 kids, as I mentioned, I had brothers and sisters who we were almost like 2 separate families, but we were the same family. My parents took a big break in between and then had 2 and then big break and then 3 of us, and a brother that's 3 years older, sister that's 2 years older, and then me. And so we were like this cluster of getting in a lot of trouble, having a lot of fun along the way. But I think more than anything, I think back on both my parents were 40 years old when they had me, which was old back then. I mean, I had the oldest parents, and my parents used to say to me when we like go out at night, go off to parties, they'd say, just don't do anything that embarrasses me and come home at night. And so my friends would always be like, your parents are hysterical, like that they'd want to know, and they'd always be there, and they were awesome parents, and they had rules, we couldn't like drink in the house, we couldn't, all of this stuff, but they trusted us a lot. And the reason why they trusted us was because we tried not to embarrass them. Sometimes we did anyway, and they were like, oh my God, this is crazy. When my brother drove his car into a canal, and like things like that they were definitely a mark against him. I of course was perfect, but not really. But I think that those kind of things that really help to make you along the way too, when you get a lot of when you get a big rope handed to you, and you say like, don't screw it up early on, you have a lot of room to be creative, I guess. And as long as you can kind of come back to the zone when you need to.
What was high school like?
So high school was super interesting. When one of the stories actually that I talk about in my book is my dad. So my dad had what started at Armor Food Company, and then they were acquired by a company called the ConAgra. And my dad was always coming up with all these ideas for little companies along the way. Even though he was working inside of a big company, he had started a brand called Healthy Choice. And so I, of course, did not appreciate the fact what Healthy Choice ultimately came to be. But I always knew he was like super creative and was an entrepreneur in the making, and always kind of curious why he didn't go out on his own and kind of hang his own shingle, because instead I think he really viewed it as a huge risk that he couldn't take. I appreciate it as a parent now, knowing that my dad sort of decided not to really do what he wanted to do ultimately, because he felt that he had to put food on the table and a roof over the head and 5 kids, and he wanted to make sure we all went to college and, you know, whatever his dreams were for us. But I think that the interesting thing for me when I was in high school was that my dad was laid off, and it was something that I saw, you know, that we never thought was possible. So my sister and my brother were both off at university. My brother and sister, oldest ones, were long gone, and so I'm at home with my parents, and my dad comes home and says he's laid off. And I was like, you know, how did you let that happen? I mean, I was horrible, right? Like, I was like, how did this, you know, happen? And he's like, well, I didn't have an MBA. And so I'm waiting for the segment of CNN to come on in the 80s where they laid people off at any age for not having an MBA. MBAs were hugely, you know, important. And so here, like, this guy's like running the largest product inside of ConAgra, and he gets laid off for not having a badge, essentially. And so here, he was so loyal to this large company, and yet it didn't matter. And I saw that, you know, at age 16, that my world was rocked. His world was rocked, but it was a super interesting time. And anyway, fast forward, while he's out looking for a job in his, you know, late 50s at this point, not sort of the ideal time to be looking for a new job. It was the only job he had ever had, essentially, you know, working at Armor, which was then acquired by ConAgra. He ended up going back to some of his suppliers. And so his suppliers were food, basically food that went into, you know, these healthy choice meals. So shrimp fishermen off the coast of St. Simon's Island, Georgia, were his buddies, and he used to go and, you know, shrimp fish with them. And so he kept asking them for contacts and see if they knew anybody who was hiring, and he'd check in with them every few months. And one of the guys who ran one of the boats said, do they know that we don't have MBAs? Like, we don't even have college degrees. They're laughing about the fact that, you know, this big company is laying off my dad because they really like my dad a lot. So they refused to sell shrimp to ConAgra. Wow. They all like banded together because they like my dad so much. And my dad was like, don't do that. Like, that's really bad. And they're like, oh, don't worry about it. There's other companies that will really want our shrimp. And so the importance of relationships for me, again, as a high schooler, I was like, that's kind of badass, like, that they're doing that. I mean, I'm glad you're not telling them to do that, but a little part of me was like, I don't know, like, I don't want to know if you are telling them to do that either. Like, it's just, I think it's, you know, good for them that they're sticking up for you. So after about, I guess it was about 9 months that they weren't selling to ConAgra, he got a phone call and they said, okay, we'll give you your job back. And there's a condition, you have to move to Omaha, Nebraska. And my dad was like, yeah, like, he didn't want to move to Omaha. My mom didn't want to move to Omaha, but it was their only choice. And that was the only way that they were going to get their pension back in the day when companies gave pensions. And so he's like, okay, fine, I'll move to Omaha, Nebraska. We'll make the best of it. And so I was like, well, I'm going to be a senior. I'm not moving to Omaha, Nebraska. And he said, you know what? This is on me. You can stay. And I'm like, wait, what? I'm a senior. This is the summer before my senior year in high school. And he said, you're welcome to come with us. My kids always asked, did your parents like hate you and say like you were behind? I'm like, no, I mean, they felt terrible, that he really felt like he should have seen it coming, and he wasn't going to put me through the process of moving to Omaha, Nebraska. And so we hadn't sold our house. And so I stayed in Scottsdale. And there's many people who went to high school with me who were quite happy that I was,
I'm sure.
living in this house.
Party time.
And it was great. I mean, it was a lot of fun, but I think that more than anything, I learned responsibility. And I think I had a great training wheels for this because my parents had given me a lot of rope, and they basically said, as long as you don't screw it up, you can stay and call us every day. I never missed those phone calls, right? I'd, check in with them. It was all good. And we never let things get so out of control that I was going to have, the plug pulled on me. But again, learning that early on, that responsibility, I think it's, as a parent, even today, it's something that I think about a lot. It's like, especially when people are asking for it, but also seeing whether or not they can kind of, adhere to that next level and keep upping the level, which I think that's sort of a leadership and training in some ways.
One thing I want to just quickly backtrack on a little bit, because I think it's so important, and you just sort of, brushed over it. Though I think it could arguably be the most important piece to business that people tend to overlook: relationships. I believe in my heart of hearts that the business of business is relationships, and the foundation of relationships is trust. And I think far too many business people, and I'm not making a generalization, but I'm just saying that a lot of business people that I've been in business with and also have conducted business with care far too much about the bottom line, and will sacrifice a long-standing relationship for a better potential financial opportunity. I can't emphasize enough how passionate I am about relationships and how much relationships mean to me. And it sounds like to you, through watching that experience with your dad, I mean, it's such a glaring example that the relationships that we develop, I was sitting down with Danny Meyer, is a mentor of mine, and his business partner, Richard Crane, became a very close friend and mentor of mine as well. I spent more time with Richard than with Danny on a mentorship sort of basis. And I'll never forget, we used to have like a quarterly meeting at Maialino in the city. And one morning he said to me, Mike, if there's anything I've ever said to you, if there's anything that I want to make sure you sort of really embrace and grasp, is this idea that every single time a guest walks into one of your restaurants, they are a relationship waiting to happen. And if you don't take the opportunity, somebody else will. And I close my eyes, I can clearly see him saying it to me. And it just stuck with me, because I have always been this relationship development person. I believe that, I'm not a smart guy. That's the truth. And I'm like an intellectually smart guy. I was not a great student, but I've excelled in business because I really do believe in people. And I believe that relationships are so, so important. And so can you talk about relationships for a little bit?
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think that it's, the interesting thing that you touched on, though, is that it's sort of about putting the first foot forward, though, too, what that conversation was that you just mentioned, right? That oftentimes people don't think about it, right? And especially when they're in sort of your space in some way. And so I think for me, I was always a social person, and I wanted to say hi to people and, all of that. But I think getting to know people a little bit more, getting to really understand, I guess you call it EQ to some extent today. But it's really, I think that's something that's starts to build these relationships over time. And I think so many people just don't do that. But I think for me too, that I was always just so curious about people. And I mean, even, my parents used to say whenever I would see a for sale sign on the block, I would, watch, and I go knock on the door. I'm like, oh, when are you moving? Because I'd want the new family. Like, I'd want to know the backstory. Oh, do you know who's moving in here? No, we don't know yet. We haven't sold the house. I'm like, okay, well, so when are you guys moving? And I'd sort of add up like when they're coming in, and then I'd be like the welcoming committee. I'd be like, do you have any kids? Like, we play, hide and seek. We do all kinds of things, around here. And I was always kind of in many ways Switzerland. I didn't try and figure out, I still to this day have friends in lots of different circles because I had lots of different interests. And I think it satisfied my curiosity, but it also allowed me to build relationships in lots of different communities, especially as an adolescent. When I didn't like one group that I was hanging out with for a while, I go hang out with the other group for a little while. And I found this world that I was living in was people were always trying to figure out, where does she sit? Because she's got lots of different, I didn't just hang out with one certain group. And like I said, still to this day. And I think as a leader too, I mean, it's even running my company and building my company from scratch. I'm still trying to learn. I'm still trying to, figure out so many different aspects of our business. I wasn't afraid to, go and bottle our product or, put cases on the shelf, or even though I came from direct to consumer, even before I was learning this whole new industry, there were things in direct to consumer that I really hadn't focused on. And I went back and learned them, everything from, basic engineering to, how to build a subscription business and life cycle business and retention and all of that kind of stuff. I was just curious and wanted to learn all of those things. And I think that, again, when you put your first step forward and sort of show people that you have an interest in something, whether it's a customer or it's an employee or it's a friend, it's really not that tough because so many people don't do that.
Mm.
And I think that that's just something that it is something that I've seen in my journey.
I love it. And I agree with you wholeheartedly. Taking that first step is rarely something that people think about doing. And because I was in the restaurant industry for so long, I made it my job to specifically with the team of people that I would hire to really be curious about who they were. And I think that's what sort of distinguished me as a leader because I really did put the team first. And then ultimately that trickled down to the guests that walked into the restaurants, because then the team felt comfortable enough to, take a seat at a table with with a guest and actually engage in conversation if they felt like they had the right sort of, character at a table. So yeah, I that first step of engagement, I think, is really important in business, and people really do appreciate it. You call yourself an accidental entrepreneur, and because I want to get into the hint story. Will you unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah. So I never really thought about becoming an entrepreneur. I worked for incredible entrepreneurs, starting with CNN, so Ted Turner, and then ended up moving to San Francisco, stumbled upon this little startup that had spun out of Apple. I didn't work for Steve Jobs, but I worked for people who worked for Steve Jobs that had sort of, very much the ethos of kind of Steve Jobs' way. And then we were acquired by a company called America Online, so Steve Case. And so here I'm working for three very different, but three incredible entrepreneurs, and whether directly or indirectly. And a lot of people have said, oh, come on, you knew it. Like those were training wheels for you becoming an entrepreneur. And not at all. I mean, the idea for Hint came about really when I was taking a few years off. You and I were talking before the podcast started about, my commute to New York City over many, many years. Every week I would fly back, which was way too much airplane time. United Airlines pilots all knew my name. And after a while, I'm like, I had two kids and I was pregnant with my third. And I thought, I want to be a parent. Like I'm never going to be able to kind of go back in time and do over in some ways. And I wanted to take some time. People kept asking me, how much time are you going to take? I'm like, I don't know. And, I'm not sure. And they'd say, you mean like 6 months, a year? Because we want to know, because we're interested in getting you to come on our team or whatever. And I'm like, I don't know. I need to sort of figure it out. And it was during that time when I really didn't know when I was going to go back, if I was going to go back into tech or not, that's when I came up with this idea for Hint. And I really started focusing on my own health and starting with how I felt, but also the idea that I had gotten way out of shape from just focusing all my hours and every single day on work. And I was, as I mentioned earlier, I'd been a gymnast and I knew I was a runner. And so I just started exercising again. And I was trying to get a bunch of weight off that I'd gained over the course of many pregnancies and couldn't get it off. I kept looking at different diets. I had never dieted over, my whole life. I hadn't dieted, but nothing was working. And I'd finally just about given up. And then I started looking at the ingredients on my diet soda, my Diet Coke in particular, and was just thinking, wow, I am so focused on what I put in my kids' bodies, what I put in my car. But I don't even think about what I put in my own body. And that was almost 17 years ago. And it was just this epiphany. I mean, I still run into people to this day who say, I remember we're trying to talk to you about a job. And you're like, do you know how much stuff is in our food? Do you know that there's like, organic versus, I mean, all of this stuff was just this like huge learning that was out there that most people were not thinking about, but for whatever reason, I was thinking about it. I was never a, nutritionist or a cook, or I was an okay cook, but I mean, this was never really my focus, but just taking that time to kind of figure out what I was interested in, all of a sudden I saw the holes in the market. And that's when I dropped my Diet Coke. Now I call it my Diet Coke addiction, for plain water. And I realized that I should have been drinking a lot more plain water growing up in Arizona, but I never did because I thought plain water was boring. And that's why I started drinking diet soda. And I started slicing up fruit and throwing it in the water just to get me to drink this plain water while I was getting off of the diet soda. And after 2.5 weeks of doing this little test, that's when I lost over 20 pounds, 24 pounds in 2.5 weeks. It was insane. It was like, boom. And
Whoa.
yeah, it was crazy. And I just was like, I couldn't really understand why this was happening. I actually thought I might be sick. And that was, the timing of it was just kind of serendipitous with, really what was really going on with myself. And what I realized was that this reaction that I was having to diet sweeteners, and now, they talk about it as insulin resistance. I was never diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, but I think I was close. I think I was like right on the cusp. And here I had always thought of myself as a very healthy person. that I was, drinking Diet Coke. I was, eating pretty good. I wasn't having 12 cupcakes a day, but I just could not fix myself. And so when people came to me and they started talking to me about, going and doing this tech job, it wasn't that I wasn't interested in it, but I was like, I just felt this passion and this interest and this learning and, something that I was really, really fascinated with. And that was really the beginnings of Hint. And people would say to me, you should, like, are you going to do anything with this water that you're making? I'd go to the gym and I'd have a pomegranate inside of my, glass, my, cig bottle at the time. And people would joke around, like, is there raspberries or like, that's a pretty good idea. Like what, we've got this product called vitamin water. And I'd say, oh, vitamin water has lots of sugar in it. They didn't even have a diet version of it at the time. I said, no, this is different. I just want water that tastes better. And so the more I saw potential customers in front of me without even knowing that they were potential customers, really interested, and I was educating them about this product, I thought, maybe I'll just take it to Whole Foods and my local Whole Foods and see if I can get a product on the shelf. I didn't even at this point say, I'm going to launch a company. I kept saying, I'm going to see if I can get it on the shelf because it'd just be fun. Like it would just entertain me to get a product on the shelf. I didn't even know there was like a national buying group in Austin. I mean, I was clueless about any of this. And I think you talked about fears earlier. I think that oftentimes we put fears in front of ourselves. We label things as like starting a business, starting a company. That's still, to me, to this day, sounds scary. Instead, I've always been pretty good at figuring out what are the steps, hold that goal way out there of starting a company or whatever, and just do the steps instead, because it's way easier to sort of figure out how to get there. And I think that was the early days of Hint.
I mean, I love hearing the moment. I love hearing about the moment because they're typically unexpected moments. And at least the authentic business stories, right, are kind of like come out of a, you were drinking diet soda and realized. I also love the analogy of like, you cared about everything you put into your kid's body and you cared about what you put into your car, but you didn't care enough about what you were putting into your own body to fuel your system. Interestingly enough as well, that happened for you 17 years ago, roughly. And 17 years ago, I had a life-changing experience that's put me in my journey where I got sober, and I had the exact same epiphany. I just did not care about what I was putting into my body at all. Actually, like it was the far extreme of that. I was more interested in putting things into my body that were, I didn't really think of how terrible they were for me at the time, but I just didn't care, right? And so I had this life-changing moment where I needed to change. And I got sober, and like you, pretty much everything in my life changed. I also probably lost 20 pounds in, 60 days and started to see the forest through the trees. But I really do just love hearing those moments, especially coming from a person that experienced it. And now this amazing company that you're running, the journey, I can only imagine. I'm so interested in the journey. Are there any moments that you can share with us that that stand out for you? You've said leader a few times in the convo where you were like, wow, like this is a real thing and I am actually leading this company. Were there any moments where that was like,
Well, so here's one actually that I don't talk about in my book because I had turned in my book manuscript right before COVID hit. So it's March 11th, 2020. I'm in New York City. We have an office in New York, and our main office has been in San Francisco, but we have an office in New York, and I've got to go out there for some meetings. But as I land in our office, it's just this feeling. I mean, if you remember that week in New York, I mean, it was pretty gnarly. I mean, they were closing down, talking about closing down the bridges and tunnels going into the city. And I just looked at our team and thought, you know, these guys are really stressed out. And I said, why is everybody in the office if they're so stressed out? And, you know, they were worried about going on the subway and whatever. And I called our HR group in San Francisco, and I said, it's really different here in New York right now than it is in San Francisco. And just let everybody should just be working from home. I mean, it's everybody, like, we're putting way too much emphasis on everybody coming into an office right now. Like, let's just let people like do what they need to do. And I think probably some of the first COVID cases, at least in New York, were sort of showing up on our block. I think the Gap had some of the first ones, and they were right across the street from our office, so everybody was a little bit freaked out. So that's when I headed back on March 13th back to San Francisco, and my son said, hey, you know, I know you're landing at like 9:30. Do you mind stopping at Target right by the SFO? Oh, gee, Friday night, you know, good times. I was like, sure, whatever, I'll stop there. And I am always checking stock on the shelves of Hint, of course. And I go and look for the Hint in the Target store. It's a big Target store. There's not a single bottle of Hint. And so I do what I've always done as a founder. I walk in the back room, you know, I get yelled at by the manager. I'm like, it's all good. I work here, you know, like I go through, you know, this whole process, and there's not a drop of Hint anywhere. And here it is, 10 o'clock at night, and on Friday night. And, you know, I'd been hearing about hoarding. I'd been hearing about, you know, toilet paper, you know, can't find any of this, bleach, whatever, but never did I really think that Hint was one of those products. But it's water. And so, so part of me was like, oh, everybody wants Hint. But then I'm thinking, there's no Hint anywhere for people to buy. And why isn't it actually getting on the shelf? Because I knew that we had enough stock. But what I started realizing was that there was this problem between our warehouses and actually getting on the shelf at Target. And so I went up to the cash register and I said, can you see exactly what's showing up? Because the automatic replenishment should have been coming off of the cash register, and it showed 0. And I said, so why isn't it ordering? Why isn't it ordering product? This poor person, like at the cash register, is like, who are you, lady? It's like Friday night. I want to go home. And so it was at that point that I knew we had a problem. And so I'm driving home. I call our head of sales and I said, listen, we've got a big problem. I mean, if the EDI systems are broken in a store as big as a Target, I'm sure it's happening in some of the other locations. I'm going to wake up tomorrow morning and go check it out. So I went to San Francisco, same problem. I then went into Whole Foods, some of our other, and it's a mess. I mean, it's just everywhere. So it was at this point where I really thought about my biggest pet peeve is when people come to me or come to a manager and say, we've got a problem. Instead of
what about the solution?
Where's the solution? And so I said, we've got a problem and I'm not going to put this on you guys. Instead, I'm going to say, here's what we're going to do. We're going to call every single one of these buyers all over the US, and we're going to offer to send a truck in we'll figure out the payment, whatever, later. I'm not worried about it, but we've got to quickly bypass this EDI system. And they were like, well, I don't know if we can do that. I'm like, just try and do it. Just fix the problem. We had like 50% of the companies that we deal with say, yes, please send trucks in right now. I mean, the EDI systems basically were the electronic data transmission, essentially, were just totally inundated, and they could not keep up with what was going on in terms of buying. So that's what I was realizing. But again, in order to fix the problem, sometimes you have to get in there a little bit manually and roll up your sleeves and figure out how to do it. So anyway, it was at that point where I was leading, figuring out sort of the way. I didn't have a roadmap. Nobody else in the beverage industry was doing what we were doing. People are like, are you talking to other people? I'm like, no. They're like, I don't know. We don't know how to bypass it, whatever. And I was like, okay, well, this is what I'm doing. If you guys want to follow me, fine. If nobody wants to follow, that's okay too. We just kept going. And we actually gained significant shelf space during that time because we just went. Like, and this is a lesson of understanding that you can't stay complacent. It might have been the wrong move. We didn't have all the I's dotted and T's crossed, but the key thing was that I was not going to stand still. And I had to just keep moving along the way. And then as things started to get even hairier over the next couple of weeks, and San Francisco office finally, followed suit, closed down. New York had totally shut down at this point. All of our team was hearing on the news that it was shelter in place orders. And I was hearing from our plants, which are regulated by the FDA, that we had to be running 24 hours a day, that we were an essential product. I'm like, I know we're essential. I get that I've always thought we were essential. And they're like, well, when you go into pandemic status and you're running an essential product, you have to use best efforts. Your team has to be out there merchandising, showing that you're supporting all the workers in the stores. And so while our team was thinking that they were supposed to be sheltering in place, I'm telling my team, I know that's what you heard on the news, but you're not actually sheltering in place because you're an essential product that is FDA regulated and we will lose our license. So here are your gloves and your masks and your hand sanitizers, and let's go. And I felt at that point, after saying it over and over again and taking phone calls from employees and holding Zoom calls and all of that, I felt like, how can I actually sit inside my office and say this to my team without being out there with them? I mean, that to me, I thought just seemed just asinine. Like it seemed like I was telling them to go risk stuff, their lives maybe, but not willing to go there myself. And so it was at that moment that I, put on my my Lululemon leggings with the Hint branding on it and my shirts, and I went out there and took on a route. And there were a lot of people who over the years, we have a lot of longtime employees, but we have some that haven't worked here for very long. And they were like, the CEO of the company is actually taking a route. Yeah, right. And they said, no, she probably is actually. She's in Marin County. She's figuring out exactly, how to have the entire team work in less stores closer to their homes. We didn't lay off one single person during this time because we said to our team, if you're willing to be reallocated into sales jobs, then you might have been doing going into offices yesterday, but now you're going to be going into Safeway or Costco or whatever it is, that we had 2 people who quit. They didn't want to have that role. But everybody else said, hey, I'm just happy that you guys are thinking about this and trying to make it work. We weren't changing titles. We weren't changing salaries. But again, a lot of people at the time, I didn't really know what I was doing. I just knew that I was leading with, I couldn't stay complacent. I had to do something. There was a possibility that it was wrong, but I was going to be out there just in case I needed to pull back the reins in some way and try and figure out better ways to do things that maybe people hadn't thought of. Maybe they had thought of it, but that was a lesson for me for sure in leading. And I think in many ways, and then I'll be quiet. I think in many ways too, I think sort of working under leaders, particularly in tech, where you didn't have the roadmap and you just went out and tried and you kept trying to up the ante along the way and figure it out and sort of share with people, when you don't know what you're doing, when you're a little scared, but you're willing to go out there and try. I just think that there's a humanness to it that is not necessarily apparent in all organizations and all types of people, maybe who claim to be leaders out there, that I think is especially during a time like COVID, where they want to hear, from their leader. They want to see their leader going out there and doing something that scares them a little bit.
I mean, with that story, so many things came up for me listening to you that have been such great lessons for me over the years as well. This idea that offense is essential and defense is necessary, but it's not essential to win. Defense is, I have worked with people that, and I use this analogy a lot, I've worked with people over the years that are comfortable simply not losing. And I sort of bring it back to like, I'm a football fan, and the Cleveland Browns actually have changed their traditional historic losing trajectory over the last few years. But for a long time, the Cleveland Browns were really, they were not a winning team. And I always said, to the teams of people I was managing, if you think for a second, for even 1 second, that the conversation in the locker room pre-game is that of, all right, guys, all we got to do is not lose. That's all. I'm not concerned about scoring, not concerned about touchdowns. Let's keep them from scoring touchdowns. That is not the conversation.
No.
Ever. The conversation is, we are going to fucking win. We are going to do everything in our power to win. And we're going to do it as a team. And there is nothing that is impossible. Because if you were to look at their losing streak, winning, especially against a great team, seemed to be impossible. But if they took the bait on that impossible, there's no chance, not even a single sliver of chance. And what I learned from what you just said, and also from some experiences that I've had, is this idea that when you present as a leader an idea, and someone on the team, whether it's an intern or an executive, says, we can't do that, my gut instinct right then and there is, this person's not on the team. I totally agree. This person's just not on the team, because impossible is what we strive to do as leaders, right? Like if you're on the battlefield and the bombs are dropping, and your recourse or your response to that is run the other way and hide forever and dig a hole and stay there until, the coast is clear, there's no chance you have an opportunity to to win the war. It's impossible. You can't do it. You can't do it hidden in a foxhole. You know, you got to get out there.
And I think, you know, it's interesting. The more of these times, and I think it sounds like I've had them as well, that are challenging times. They're your armor, right? Later on in life, that you've been through a lot of scary stuff. I mean, I now talk about how I knew how to move forward. I looked back on 2008, 2009, which was an incredibly scary time for Hint. And it was, you know, we were a couple of years old. We were about to run out of cash. It was incredibly one of the toughest times for us to survive. And the thing that I learned was that I couldn't wake up and just sit there and do nothing, right? I had to make phone calls. I had to keep trying and, you know, and try and find a way to move forward. And I think in many ways, like that lesson, although very, very different from COVID, that was my armor for dealing with COVID in many ways. That I had another CEO say to me, "You are so zen through this process." And I'm like, I just got to do what I can do. And then I also have to just keep moving forward. I have to find ways to allow myself to move forward. And I think I'm grateful for these challenging times that I've sort of lived through too, because I think that those just make you a more interesting person, a more resilient person. And I think in many ways, one that, while I don't choose to sort of go through another COVID situation, I can, right? Nothing really scares me. And
sounds like you had to run another mile for Mr. Morris.
Right? I know. And it's just, it's crazy. One of the, if we have a few more minutes, I mean, one of the chapters that I talk about in my book is around hiking the Grand Canyon. And I remember I'm terrified of heights. And I kept thinking about the first time I was ever like figured out that I was afraid of heights was at the Grand Canyon as a little girl. And so I went back years later. I thought, I'm going to hike it and I'm going to go tackle it because I don't want to fear the Grand Canyon anymore. And as I was going through the Grand Canyon, no matter how much planning I did for that trip, and I sort of psyched myself out for, you know, everything that could possibly happen, worse stuff happened along the way. And the one thing that I kept thinking about, I ran into a rattlesnake and a pack of coyotes. I mean, there were so many like little things along the way that I never really thought about. I automatically went back to some of the scariest times that I had ever been in and thinking, I got this. I just have to keep moving forward and I have to figure out how to not stay still. And I think that it's something that is really, really powerful and something that I truly believe to this day is that all those challenging times that you have sort of prepare you for business, for personal, whatever it is, in order for you to get through in the future. And I'm just a huge believer in that.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that the losses or the quote unquote failures or the times we fall down and get injured or the times we don't win are the absolute most powerful times in life for me and it sounds like you as well, right? Like you know, the learnings in the times that we are in suffering and pain and trying to figure out exactly the right decision and how do we get out of this relationship and, you know, without running from it, without hiding from it, without, you know, brushing it under the rug, we have such opportunity for growth. And I think that that's such a great lesson for anyone listening now who's sort of sitting in a rut or sitting in a really tough place in life, thinking that there's no solution, thinking that they're alone, or that there's that the walls are caving in. I've been there. It sounds like you've been there.
Mm-hmm.
The advice that I would give, and I would also ask your advice too, to share, but the advice that I would give is to embrace it and actually almost gamify it and say, how can I use this experience as an opportunity to grow? And look at it with the glass half full as opposed to empty, because the growth opportunity that we have at our fingertips in the times of despair and grief, and I say grief because I have, my mother is, she lost 2 husbands, and she's been sitting with grief for a long time, and I know that it's really hard and difficult. And so I have a lot of experience with someone who's dealing with grief on a very intense level. And so, I'm obviously empathic and totally see it, but I think that you have a choice.
Mm-hmm.
You can sink with it, or you can catch the wave to get out of it. And I do believe that we have opportunities as human beings, and we have choices to make those decisions. I have a few more things that I want to get before we go, and I know that we're over time. So are you okay?
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay,
good.
Cool. Habits are a huge part of my life. And for years, I think we spoke about earlier, they really, I say habits will make or break us, and they broke me for a long time, and now they certainly make me. I would love to hear about any habits that you do on a consistent basis that have kind of helped to shape the life you live today.
So exercise is key for me, and it's and I've sort of turned it over the years to being in nature. I think nature is, I haven't quite defined exactly what it is, but for me, it's waking up and having like a new environment every day. It could be the same trails, but sort of making sure that I'm kind of not just living a day like, Groundhog Day, and instead just recognizing new trees, new birds, whatever it is in the world. And I think that that's something that, just feeds my soul. And it's something that I think unfortunately living in urban cities, I found it hard to sort of, I missed that a lot, but maybe it's growing up in Arizona and sort of having such great scenery. But for me, the outdoors and sort of, living and breathing that and making that a part of every single day of my existence is really, really key.
You wrote a book. It's called Undaunted. I really just want to ask you what inspired it, what we can expect from it, and how we can get it.
Yeah. So the book started, it was my journal, and it was about 6 years ago. I guess that is a habit of mine too. I was traveling all over the US and speaking about building Hint and staying in too many Holiday Inn Expresses, and didn't know what room. I'd have to take a picture of the number on the hotel room after a while because they all looked the same. And so I started journaling and started thinking and about answers to questions, typically questions that came at the end of these talks that people would ask me. I'd take 1 or 2, and those were my prompts. And then I'd start just writing them out every night. Like, how would I answer it differently? And then after 4 years, I just started counting. I stupidly didn't put page numbers down on the bottom. And I was like, God, this thing is like really thick. It was 600 pages. Wow. And so I said to a friend of mine who's an author, I was like, I think there's a lot of people that don't go to the conferences that I go to, or, don't work for the companies that have hired me to come inside and speak. So how would I bind my notes and get them out to people? And she said, you mean publish a book? And I said, no, 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 I'm a CEO. There's no, when do I have time to write a book? I can't write a book. And she's like, wait, you have 600 pages? Send it to me. Let me look at it. And she said, you at least have one book. You probably have two books in there. And I said, really? And people have said, did you always want to write a book? I was a journalism major in college. And they're like, did you always know you were going to write a book? I started my career at Time Magazine. I'm like, no, I didn't, like, not at all. I mean, I think for me, it was just, I really enjoyed kind of thinking, and I guess just writing to some extent too. It helped me just think about how to be better. And so the book in many ways was kind of an extension of that journal. The hardest part was editing it down to a digestible book size. So it's like 200 pages. It's a super quick read. The most interesting thing for me that I didn't really think about until it started selling out there was that I knew it would be great for entrepreneurs. I knew it'd be great for food and beverage entrepreneurs, but the number of people who have reached out to me, who have been sitting in the C-suite, who weren't entrepreneurs, who had never been an entrepreneur, and maybe this is coupled with, COVID as well, but they're like, you talk a lot about risk and about how we don't actually take the risks that we're supposed to be taking in life. And without risk, it's difficult to grow. And that's what I got out of your book. Like, I'm wondering why I won't take risks. Do I feel like I would look stupid? Do I feel like, I don't need to because I'm a CEO of a company? And I mean, it's crazy, the conversations from people that I didn't know, major public companies writing to me, reaching out to me saying, your book ignited something for me that I didn't know I was missing in my life. And I don't know what that means yet, but this conversation has come up again and again and again. So if I can actually, whether it's, being Mr. Morris or coaching people to just kind of live their life to their fullest, I'm in. I didn't write the book for that reason, though. I wrote the book just because I felt sorry for people not being in the audience who might have wanted to ask me a question about, starting a company. But the bigger change, I mean, that to me is something that is really, truly, like, that hits me in the heart, like to know that I could affect people so profoundly in that way, because that was not my intention in writing a book.
Gosh, I cannot wait to read that book.
I know. It's
I think
it's exciting.
I think you and I share that passion for the uncertainty and risk taking. Sometimes my wife wishes I was not as much a risk taker as I am.
You have to have the yin and yang.
Yeah. This was such an awesome conversation.
Yeah.
I feel like the sun has changed its direction since we've been talking, and I've been so engaged in this convo. I got to have you back on for another episode, because I really want to dig into the world of CPG and direct to consumer, and sort of get a little bit more technical with you, because I think that industry is really taken. It's really become center stage, obviously, in the last 2 years. That is ultimately how people are consuming products, right? It's people are really, the world of consumer packaged goods, specifically direct to consumer or through Amazon, are really, it's incredible what's been happening. I actually just launched a new company in direct to consumer wellness as well. So I might hit you up offline to pick your brain. But this was such an incredible conversation. I can't thank you enough for taking the time with me here. The value is incredible, and I know that the listeners are going to absolutely love this one. I've got to ask you one last question, which I ask everybody at the end of at the end of an episode. Do you, Kara Goldin, think that you were born to do what you do today, or were you made over time?
A little of both. So yeah, it's a tough one, but I think it's let's just say that I think my journey was made for me to do what I'm doing today. And I fully believe that every single day, and it's in many ways, I can't say that it's always written, but I think there's always choices. There's always forks in the road along the way, and everybody's got their map that is out there, and you've got to just be aware of how, and I think be thankful that you do have choices along the way, and it's your role in life, whether you're born or not born, to be this way, to appreciate that map along the way that will make you what you are today.
Kara, I appreciate you. You've really given us a lot of your time today, and this was such a wonderful conversation. I'll remember it for a long time. So thank you so much for taking it with us.
Thanks so much.
You're awesome. Where can people find you online?
All over social at Kara Goldin with an I, and the book is called Undaunted: Overcoming Doubts and Doubters. Bookstores, Amazon, on Audible. So it's all over the place.
Thank you, ladies and gents. This has been awesome. I hope you got the value that I certainly did. This is probably one of the greatest, sort of motivators for me doing this podcast, is that I get to sit across the computer today from incredible, inspirational people like Kara. And so I really appreciate it. Thanks so much. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.